Hello and welcome to this section. In this section, we will learn the relevant knowledge of the action group. In this section, we mainly include the following knowledge points. First, we will understand what the action group is and in what scenarios to use it. Then we will learn the non-participating action group and the participating action group, and finally we will learn the callback of the action group. So first, let's learn what our action group is. Our action group widget is located on the right side of our editor in the same column as the event action group. The action group is composed of multiple actions, including a series of target objects and target actions. The main function of the action group is to package the repeated logic in the project and call the action group to realize the call to the complex logic, which can also effectively reduce the complexity of the project and enhance the maintenance and readability of the project. Reasonable planning of the packaging level of the action group can make the main logic of the event clearer and increase the readability of the project logic. So let's first open the editor and take a look at where the action group is. We can directly open the previous guessing numbers such as small game. We will add an action group. Where is the action group? You can see that it is in our logic toolbar, under our event custom event. This is our working group, and the adding method is very simple. We find its parent and then click our action group. Just like adding widget, we can add our action group to our object number. Then first, let's take a look at an property of an action group. It contains a definition of whether to receive parameters synchronously, return parameters and action groups. The action group itself has only one trigger condition, that is, our action starts. That is to say, when the action group is called, what you want him to do, he will do a series of events. First of all, we will learn how to use the lunch action group. The lunch action group is the most basic use of the action group. It is to encapsulate multiple repeated action into an action group. We do not need one of its receive parameters or one of its return parameters. Generally speaking, all of our actions for an initialization of the page, including our series of repeated logic, we can select our lunch action group for a production. For example, in an environment like ours, we can see that when we click the refresh button, one of our input boxes will be cleared, the result will be reassigned, and then such an object will be hidden, and then our random number will be regenerated. What kind of action is this? This is actually equivalent to an initial action, right? So we can change the name of such an action group to our initialization. Let's go to such a refresh button. We can select all such a series of actions, and then we're C and click copy. Then we go to the DNG group and select our action start point to CV for a paste, so we can put the series of actions all the working groups have been copied, and then there is a choice here that is the current object. Let's click and select again, and choose to hide for such a refresh button. In this way, we have completed an initialization function. What is the initialization? Is to restore one of our default states, right? So when our page is just displayed, we don't need to let him do this series of event. What can we do? For us, we can directly call an action group like ours, which is our initialization. Then we change the refresh event here. Now we don't need it to generate a random sorting bank, assign values to the results, and clear our input box. What do we need to do? We can call such an initialization directly. So when we read an action group, how does our logic read it? You can see it too. When such a refresh button is clicked, such an action group is allowed to perform an execution. What is the content of this action group? You can see that there is an arrow-like symbol here. When we click the arrow, we can jump to such an action group. So the order of reading is let me see. When the refresh button is clicked, it performs the initialization of such an action group. The content of this action group empties the content of an input box like ours, and then copies the result to the result. Then, the refresh button is hidden, and then a new one is generated number of machines. Then, when you want to switch to the logic that we read before, you can click the feedback button in to see the logic that follows. Then, the logic of the same series is completely consistent with the logic of the page initialization on our side, so we can use the action group to pack such logic blocks to make a call directly. Then let's preview the effect. Let's turn on the check. First, let's take a look at the input content to get a 50, and then click a guess number. He told me that you guessed big to change us to a 25. It's too small. 40 is too big. 35. Oh, right. You can see that it is right. Then, when we click such a refresh button, you can see that the vegetation is cleared, and the results are displayed again. So, is it completely consistent with the existing logic of a brush defined here before? Then, this is our lunch action group, which is also the most basic one for our action group. One way to do this is to package our repetitive logic and a series of frequently used actions. Let's demonstrate what our action group with meals is. Let's create a new page directly to facilitate a preview. We drag page 2 to the bottom of page 1. In this way, when we preview page 2, it will be an effect of the first page. Then we make a very basic effect, and what to do? We make an effect of a calculator, and the computer only has addition, so let's make the UI first. For example, a content in an input box, plus, let's look for a plus sign in one of our icons, which is exactly the plus sign, then add the content of another input box, and then come to the result. This is one of our results. In order to look better, we still give it a display in the center, and let it align horizontally to the center. Let's select all the components, and then set one of its top margins to a 20, so that it has a little bit of spacing. Okay, then let's change the contents of these two text boxes to 1. Here, let's directly change them to an integer, and let it become an addition of an integer. Next, we add a button, a little bit, and a little bit of screenwriter, and then this is the basic UI that has been calculated. So what we need to do next is to make the content of these 22 input boxes when we click calculation, and then in order to achieve a calculation effect, we use the action group here to make, so we add an action group here. The name of this action group is called a calculation. Then again, it needs two receiving parameters. We will receive our first parameter and the second parameter, and then it needs a calculation. How can we calculate? Is the calculation an assignment to one of our results? What is the result of the calculation? Is the value of our parameter 1 plus a value of our parameter 2, and then we call it by clicking event. When it is clicked, we call an action group like ours. What is the parameter of its 1? Is a content of the input box 1? What are the parameters of the input box 2? It is a content of our input box 2. So how do we read the whole action group? When we go through such a click event, we call the action group. We get the legend to the group by the value of parameter 1 in input box 1, and pass the value of numerical control 2 to the action group through such a parameter 2. Then we make a calculation in the action group, and then we copy the result to such a result a text. Let's take a look at the effect. Then the value of 1 is, and the value of 22 is 3. Then calculate a result. You see, the result is equal to 5, which is calculated. So you should pay attention to how I do a value here. I make a transfer through two receiving parameters, and then I do it directly after the transfer. I make a value assignment for the result directly, but in fact, there are other ways for us. For example, it is just a sum function here, and I may not have to do it in the end for such a result replication. I need to use such a calculation function for a lot of places. So here we can add a return parameter. For example, here is an SUV, which is its return value. How to transfer the return value to the outside world? This way, we can choose from our drop-down menu. Here is a current action group. When the current action group sets the return result, it is like you return such an action group callback to call him an event, and then this side of the sum of a result. Is it the parameter in our drop-down menu, adding parameter 2 in our drop-down menu again and again? You should pay attention to one thing here, that is, in the drop-down menu, this is a parameter 1 and parameter 2 on the current object side, which is consistent with a parameter name here. That is to say, if you change the parameter name here, the parameter value corresponding to the drop-down menu here will also change. If there is a change, will there be a change in the value here? Because after such an action group is called, it just finds a sum, but does not assign a sum to anything. Now we can notice that since I have set a return result here, What does it have in such an action group? He has a callback, so when such an action group is finished, he can do the next event, right? When such a result is calculated, does it want to assign a value to one of our results? Then what is the content of the assignment? Because we can find a sum called return result in the pull-down game. Where does this sum come from? Is this sum a return parameter defined by ourselves in one of our action groups? And when we return the result, we return it with a value like sum. So we can have a parameter like SUV here. Okay, let's preview it to see an effect. Here we will calculate a result of 4 plus 6, click a calculation, you see it is equal to 10, but this one is equal to 10, just equal to 10 is not the same thing. Here we calculate a complete result through the action group, and then we assign a value to the text of such a result, equal to a return result of our calculation, so we do finished a complete definition of an action group. The method of adding is very simple, that is, when we select such an action group, we can click on such a series of variables on the left. Since we will explain the variable widget separately later, we will try the simplest one here. For example, we add a numerical variable here, and then it will be more fun here. We need to add a random number of a numerical variable here. So first of all, what are we going to do when this action starts? Let's use a numerical variable like ours to generate a random integer, and then let's use a random integer between 1 and 10. Then when it calculates a result, we add a value of such a random number. Similarly, after the difference is done here, we also add a value of such a numerical variable, which is equivalent to the difference here into a random number, and give us a result to return. Let's take another look. If we say a 10 here, a 1 here, and then click a calculation, we can also see that the original value here should be 9, but why does it become 15? It proves that we have generated such a random number and added it here. What am I actually thinking here? You can see if I call such a numerical variable randomly in our action group. You can see if I click it and select it. But note that because this variable is a local variable in the action group, it cannot be accessed externally. Let's give an example here. When I am outside, I click it through the event. We can see that he told me that local variables can be referred to in the current action service and things. Therefore, we cannot use such a variable, so such a variable is a local variable. So if we need to make a series of transfers, for example, a numerical variable 1 here, we change it. The name is called parameter 1, and then we can copy and paste another copy, which is called parameter 2. What are we actually doing when we calculate? Once we assign a value to our parameter, the content of the assignment is equal to the first parameter we accept. Similarly, we can also assign a value to our parameter 2. What is the content of the assignment? It is the second parameter we received, and then we are very simple here. Our summation is equal to the value of our parameter 1, plus a value of our parameter 2. Its difference here is the value of our parameter 1, minus the value of our parameter 2, right? Therefore, such a local variable can be used for a transfer. First get such paper, and then do a series of processing. The reason why such a local variable is often used is that when we do our time processing, it is not convenient for us to directly transfer it, whether it is a timestamp or a standard time format. Generally speaking, we will use our time variable for a transfer, but we haven't learned about time variables yet, so let's first tell you how we can transfer a variable and further operate it through local variables. When we study later, we won't feel very abrupt. In the same way, we can also preview an effect. For example, we can add a 12 and a 4 here, and the appropriate amount is 16, and then the difference is an 8. Then we will finish. We have a meal action group to use, and then we will talk about a very important knowledge point. It is our action group callback. The action group callback is not before we learn our service at this stage. Although it is very rarely used, I think it is a very good time to let you know that there is an action group callback in existence of. So let me give you a very simple example. When we talk about the service, we will further tell you how to use a callback of our action group. First of all, I will tell you how to add an action group callback. First of all, when we select such an action group, we can see that there is a widget on this side, which is bright. What is this? This is our action group callback. Then we select the image of this action group, we can add it, and we can see that there is a callback event, and then we change the callback state here, which is called successful calculation, and then there is another parameter, which is called sum, and then we add another parameter, which is called difference. So we have done well with such a callback. How can we use it? You can see that when I select such an action group, I can first delete the return result of such an action group setting, because if the action group setting returns the result, where does it execute? It performs an execution when it is finished on our side, which is equivalent to that when it is finished, it will automatically do an action group callback for us. Generally, there may be more than one return state for an action group. Especially after we learn the service, the return of the backend is changeable. So if we want the action group to package the service, we usually use a lot of action group callbacks. So here we go to click an action group callback here, and we can see that there is an event under it called trigger, that is, when it runs here, it will execute such an event. Similarly, here, we write the sum and difference, which is the value of our parameter 1, plus a value of our parameter 2. Similarly, its difference is the value of our parameter 1 minus a value of our parameter 2. Note that the calculation here will change a little. Why? You can see what triggers here. It's a successful calculation trigger, and what have I written here so far? Yes, so we need to rewrite a callback here. We'll simply delete this callback here and write it again. Then, in the same way, we copy one of our parameters and copy it. What is the replication equal to? It is equal to returning a sum in the parameter. Note that, do not select the difference, nor where sum and come from. Sum is the parameter name defined from a callback state here. It is important here, so it needs your attention. Next, we also assign a value to the difference. What is the content of the assignment? It is for us to return such a difference value in it, and then we can call such an action group successfully. Let's preview the effect. Let's write it casually, that is, 12 plus 6. To click a calculation, you can see and equals to 18, and then the difference value equals to 6. So we successfully used an action group callback here. Complete a calculation. So why do we use our action group callback? For example, we add a restriction condition here. Here is our even calculator, which calculates even numbers. So if he is not even, he can't count, just 2 input parameters. If he can't count, what should he do? So we can add a callback here, which is called a failure, that is, it simply has no way to perform our calculations. Since we now want to define such an action group to calculate for an even number, we need to add a series of conditions here, such as the value of parameter 1, why is its type an even number, and what does it look like? Why should a value type of our parameter 2 also be our even number? In this case, we trigger a successful calculation and give him the difference. If he is not satisfied with such a successful calculation, what about us? We call our failure, which is equivalent to a penalty for our failure. Then we can change the action here. If the calculation is successful, he will get such a value. Then we add a callback here. After the drop-down menu, we will select a failure. If it fails, I will tell him what. If there is a prompt, please input an even number. Even calculation is defined by ourselves, so don't make too many misunderstandings here. Let's preview the effect. Here's a value. Here, let's add a 15 plus a 7, and then click a calculation. Tell me, and then what does it display? Yes, please enter an even number, right? There is no copy of anything here. I change it to a 14 plus an 8, and then click a calculation. You can see that the value here is successfully calculated. So usually it is in an action group. If it has a series of different branches, we need to make it trigger differently. Then through a series of external events, that is, if he successfully calculates what we do, and if he does not meet the conditions, then we will probably use one of our action group callbacks to complete. This action group callback will make our whole application very simple and readable when we calculate on the front end and back end. For example, let's read here. When clicking, he will perform such an even number calculation. The even number calculation is to pass in the contents of R2 and C as parameters, and then if it is successfully calculated, I can get its 1 and 1 difference. If it is not calculated successfully, you will be prompted to enter an even number, and then such a judgment condition can be written in our action group. That's all the content of this section. Thank you for watching.